Welcome to Ethics Matter. I'm Magali Laguerre-Wilkinson, and joining us today is Dan Plesch, who is an author and also the Director of International Studies and Diplomacy at SOAS, University of London. His new book is Human Rights After Hitler. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Magali.
So tell us, you went into diving into the UN War Crimes Commission, which is a precursor to what we know today as the ICC, the International Criminal Courts in the Hague. So what was your discovery? What happened? Tell me about your book. Tell me about how this was born out of a chapter from your previous book.
Well, that's kind. The earlier book, America, Hitler and the UN, I never thought I'd find myself writing so much about World War II, but what we discovered, in fact, early in the aftermath of 9/11, trying to look at more positive visions for how we could run the world, I started looking at the World War II period and discovered that the official name for the Allies was in fact the United Nations, and that from 1942, just after Pearl Harbor, Franklin Roosevelt, much criticized for his lack of foreign policy vision, in fact created the UN brand to hold the Allies together and build the post-war world. And there were a whole range of multilateral organizations. So people listening may have heard or watching may have heard of the Bretton Woods Conference. This actually was a UN conference before we ever got to San Francisco.
Before there was a UN?
Before there was a UN. And the official histories, even of the San Francisco conference, don't actually tell you, that most of the good books on this, that the San Francisco conference was also a UN conference with its own phone book and a first day postage stamp in the US. And one of these multinational, multi-governmental agencies with strong US leadership was a War Crimes Commission. Now we've grown up knowing about Nuremberg and maybe Tokyo, which tried 20, 40 top-level Nazis. A few other trials, and there was a very nice piece in the New Yorker a couple of years ago which kind of said, well, nothing much happened until they started dragging old concentration camp guards out and bringing them into court on their, on their walkers, and that was it. Not a bit of it. This commission brought charges against 36,000 individuals, which resulted in 10,000 convictions before 2,000 trials in the immediate aftermath of World War II. And all that advance work was done while London was under Nazi bombardment from the Luftwaffe and the V missiles.
That's the interesting part too, is that this is happening, indictments are happening, trials are taking place while the war is going on. It sort of seems it's strange.
Well, indeed, and given some of the ironic positions of the Polish government today, there was strong Polish leadership saying we can't wait till afterwards. We need the rule of law with international support to come in. But then, of course, with the onset of the Cold War and the repression of civil rights in America, this whole commission was shut down. And frankly, the CIA and the American right had the key turned on this whole archive, and quite an effective smear job was done to say that all the work was useless and shouldn't be looked at. But once you see the documents, you see how lively it is and how important it is.
So you touched on the smear campaign in the United States. Was this a way to deflect from certain domestic human rights violations versus international human rights violations? Talk a little bit about that.
Well, there are a combination of reasons that other scholars have also looked at, that certainly after the war, it was rebuilding Germany, bury the past, deal with the Soviets. But also part of this was, as the Secretary of War for FDR, Henry Stimson, wrote, we can't have crimes against humanity pursuing the Germans for what they do to the German Jews in their own country, because then the international community will come after us about the lynchings. And that dynamic within the US government, you might have to say quite a modern one. And Franklin Roosevelt's ambassador, an old classmate and somebody who'd seen Nazi Germany up front before Pearl Harbor, Congressman Herbert Pell. Your older viewers and listeners may know of his son Claiborne Pell and the Pell Grants. Well, his father, Herbert Pell, went off to Europe, and he had been a defender of African American rights and refugees, and he wrote, we have to stop a Nazi romantic revival in the way in which the Confederates have managed to achieve a romantic revival in the South. And he said, I may have to sacrifice my reputation, but we have to stop, in years to come. We're going to win this war, but afterwards we've got to stop the Gestapo sitting around the parish pump in the village green, regaling the boys of the joys of looting France and gassing Jews. And if there's one thing you can say that generation did do, is that we have to deal with Holocaust denial. We don't have to deal with a romantic triumphalism about the extermination of the Jews.
That gives one pause.
Well, it is a bit of a mouthful, and certainly as we went through these documents, we were astonished to find that this man Pell is proposing in London at a time when they were meeting in air raid shelters because of Nazi missile attacks. He proposes crimes against humanity months even before D-Day, not after the war, as historians tell us it happened. But this whole effort, as I say, was deeply resisted in the State Department.
And you mentioned also that it took time for them to even send him abroad to see this himself.
Yes.
It was thwarted in many different ways.
After the war, he sent an extremely caustic and lengthy memo to President Truman, who succeeded Roosevelt, explaining how Roosevelt appointed him, but then for 6 months the State Department told him he wasn't needed in London. He finally gets there and they all going, "What kept you?" And the early minutes of the commission say, "Well, we're trying to get started, but we're waiting for the Americans to come." And so they did their best to run defense on any kind of prosecution of the Nazis, because they were already looking to the post-war world and the need, frankly, to use the Nazis against the Russians.
Having access to this archive was, as I'm reading it, seemed like peeling back the layers of an onion. It can actually be a book on its own, your own story, researching this book. Can you just give us a little bit of a background of how it was? I mean, I realize that you couldn't take pictures or photocopies. You'd have to dictate at some points to your colleagues from memory what you were reading in the beginning.
There was an initial point when we first encountered it that my colleagues and I encountered the rule, which they subsequently revised, but this had been applied for decades, which was, in order to read this archive, you need to get official approval from your own government, you have to get personal approval from the UN Secretary General, and then you may not make any note or copy of what you read.
And why was that?
Well, because I think you could say, and they would say, well, because these were unsubstantiated allegations, they hadn't many of them seen their day in court. But the idea of an accusation is not a secret in a normal judicial process. So these are absurd standards. And the idea that somehow some innocent Nazi might have been accused as being a reason. And in fact, once we got hold of it, we gave a digital copy to the German prosecutor's office. And that was the first time they'd ever had a digital copy. And they only got one some 30 years after the war. They weren't ever given one by the Allies when they opened up their effort to prosecute their own nationals for war crimes. But the motivation is partly, as I say, anti-communism, but also a general sense you can't pursue really crimes against humanity and reinstitute suppression of the African American community. And I think people forget how much of an uprising of African Americans took place in World War II. The March in Washington in the war years, I think some 18% of African Americans were registered to vote in Georgia in the 1944 election. And of course, this was a deep challenge to white Southern Democrats.
To the commission itself, how are the findings in that archive relevant to today? How can they be adapted to the 21st century? Because you do talk about that a lot.
Well, there are many lessons. I'll try not to be too long-winded here, Magali. The first is that countries such as India and China are front and center in this process. Even before independence, India was involved, and the most unfashionable Chinese nationalists had much more advanced position on war crimes than did either Washington or London. And then the continental Europeans, including the Poles, and the Poles were launching astonishing charges against the Nazis for the death camps, long before D-Day. You know, the smoke is coming out of the chimneys at Auschwitz, and the Polish government has launched international indictments against the Nazis at Auschwitz and other camps in this period. So I think one of the lessons is don't wait for the end of the conflict. And we should have an international system to gather evidence for war crimes, not just wait
and
around for
there isn't
afterwards.
one?
There's none at all.
Really?
None at all.
Even with everything that we're seeing now with...
No, there's been an attempt recently with respect to Syria and the Yazidis, but there's no systematic effort. And there's no system for low-level prosecutions.
And by low level, you mean?
I mean what I call the foot soldiers of atrocity. You know, soldiers, militiamen, you know, colonels, majors carrying out these crimes. There's no system to really bring them forward into local trials. There's been some excellent work by the UN in the Congo, which I think has been very useful. But again, there's no system. And if we look at what many states were doing, including the US, we can see that these are great lessons. And the US conducted some, more than 500 military tribunal trials of the Nazis and Japanese. And to this day, the US Judge Advocate General's Office has not published them. They are on my book website. You're welcome to read them. But the US government should, because this is international law. This is precedent. But of course it can be embarrassing because they were prosecuting the Japanese for waterboarding.
And it sounds like
you're now somewhat getting back into fashion.
And you're talking about waterboarding. It sounds to me like a 21st century term, but yet it isn't.
They called it the water treatment.
The water treatment. Okay, there's the word water in there. Correct.
Yeah.
but also another surprise was also rape as a weapon of war. So these are two terms that were discovered in the archive that existed 70 plus years ago that are applied today. Were you surprised, oddly relieved that those existed, that those terms existed then?
I wouldn't say relieved. I mean, the whole issue has been a surprise. I thought I knew about this subject, and I never thought that any of this material existed until we turned the pages and found it. But I'm pleased to say we're now working with UC Berkeley and the International Sexual Violence Unit there to try to bring the evidence from the many prosecutions that we've uncovered showing sexual violence to be a war crime, dating back really to the First World War, that this was established as an international crime, and to use these in briefs in international trials today. And so that's a way in which this material is becoming practically and systematically applied into the modern period. And it's such a transformation, as I say, from thinking that the whole really basis of international criminal law is 20-odd people in Nuremberg and a few other bits and pieces, to talking about an international system that dealt with some 36,000 cases in a 5-year period.
You know, Syria, Yemen, the DRC, just to name a few.
Not to mention Iraq.
Not to mention Iraq, have conflicts that, let's hope, will one day end. They're going on as we speak. We're already witnessing the horrors just through social media. I mean, you can't avoid it. And I'm sure much worse will be uncovered when these things will one day end. What type of commission should be in place for what's to come? It can't be a one-size-fits-all type.
No, I think what we are having discussion with some countries and NGOs is to look at a technical assistance operation to provide peer review support to what people want to do in their own countries or what regional bodies want to do. Because clearly the ICC in The Hague is very important during the Crown, but it shouldn't be the only effort. You know, there needs to be a broader and, I dare I say, more economical, financially economical mechanism to deal with low-level crimes. But I think it's a mistake, if I may say, to think, oh well, it's all terrible. There's nothing we can do, because I have to say, if people escaping from the death camps, we now know, could think it was worth their while to bring prosecutions, many of which did take place, for the crimes of the Nazis while they were still going on, I don't think we have any excuse now to say, oh, it's all too difficult, or just be pragmatic.
Or let's wait.
Let's wait. Because to be frank, Magali, the pragmatists never wanted Nuremberg in the first place. They just wanted to, maybe shoot a few Nazis and then go after the Russians, turn the Wehrmacht tanks around and send them east. That was a pragmatic view, all too common, frankly, in Washington in '45. And the fact that we even got Nuremberg was a miracle, and wouldn't have happened, I think, without the Commission members. And this is, by the way, 16 countries, not just the US and the Allies, not the Soviet Union. Your people will be relieved to know, but the Western Allies, the Chinese, the Indians, in this process.
Were you surprised at the discovery that the Allies knew as much as they did about the atrocities taking place against the Jewish people, going back as far as 1940?
And particularly, there's a key moment in '42, and I have to say I find it a bit of a mystery that even Holocaust scholarship doesn't notice that there was a big public statement, really ignored in the US, but the US took part in it, and the Soviet Union, the British, and the occupied countries. And at the time of the Battle of Stalingrad, there was an international statement which said in terms, the Nazis always said they're going to kill the European Jews, now they're killing them, they're taking them to Poland, and they're killing them all in Poland. And this was said categorically at that point, in public, in 26 languages on the BBC. And that's a very clear position. And then what we see, though, from this Commission's work is that from early '44, they have affidavits, detailed evidence from the resistance showing that what was going on in the camps was known and itemized. So people who look or read about the Holocaust will know the names Drancy, Treblinka, Auschwitz. All of these places are subject to national and internationally supported war crimes indictments from before D-Day. And that was suppressed at the time. It was known within some sections of the government, others didn't want it out, but it's categorical that it's there.
What was your biggest discovery, or uncovering, if you will, in the archive?
I think the sheer scale of war crimes prosecutions, that this is a popular movement, this isn't a few bureaucrats, that you have special forces troopers in the Allies who go on to become war crimes prosecutors after the conflict.
Imagine that today.
Well, one should see it. But perhaps I suppose in one showstopper was the fact that the Czechs had brought 700 pages of indictments against Adolf Hitler himself at the time of the Battle of the Bulge in 1944.
No one knew this.
And this is utterly unknown, and probably only 30 people in the history of the world had seen these, and I published some examples of these prosecutions in my book.
Is it because people would think it's just absurd to try to even indict him? I mean, is that why this didn't even come out?
No, there was there's a lot of public pressure to indict at the time. Sorry to interrupt you. There was a lot of public pressure to indict him at the time and to indict the Nazis. The British were reluctant. The Deputy Führer had parachuted in on some quixotic mission in '41 into Britain and had been kept prisoner. But the British never charged him as a war criminal. He was there as a kind of diplomatic card, possibly for after the war. So you can't second guess people that much in retrospect, but you can see that there were powerful advocates for human rights and for war crimes prosecutions in all the Allied governments during the conflict. And as I say, until I opened up the first pages, my colleagues and I had no idea that any of this material was there.
But I have to say that it must take your breath away when you think that for 3-4 more years, the exterminations were continuing in the camps, while people knew in full view that this was going on.
One has to say, well, what more could they have done, is the question that's hanging there. I think at the first time of that sentence, the war, we, the good guys, were losing the war. Stalingrad was in the balance. There's a famous man, Jan Karski, who goes to see Franklin Roosevelt at one point, and he's well known. But at that point, the Nazis are like 100 miles from Cairo.
Wow.
And so winning the war is the priority. Later in the war, when the tide has turned, I think special forces, special operations could have used a lot of money to smuggle people out through France, Spain, the Balkans, out of Hungary. That could have been done if it was a priority, but it wasn't.
You also discovered that it seems as though, anyway, that U.S. leaders during World War II didn't believe there should be an international criminal court. In other words, let one's own country be judge and jury, and that was because.
Well, there was a decision the key allies, the big three, took in Moscow in the middle of the war that the top leadership would be tried by them, and that was what became Nuremberg. But they also said that lower-level perps should be tried in their countries. But this commission, as I say, particularly led by the continental Europeans, proposed an international criminal court. Harvard's own Sheldon Gluck is at the forefront of this. He's the mentor of Ben Ferencz.
Who wrote your foreword.
Very kind of
Yes.
kind of him indeed. But to be frank, Harvard should honour Sheldon Gluck. The State Department should honour Herbert Pell, and we need to, restore these ideas and these people into popular consciousness. We shouldn't just be, as it were, tearing down statues. We should be putting a few more up.
Today, the U.S. is still one of the few countries that has not ratified the ICC treaty. What are your thoughts on this? Is that going back to this idea that one's own country should be judge and jury?
I think it is. I mean, there is a question as to how far we cooperate together in the modern world. I guess I would just say unilateralism is not a long-term strategy. We have to cooperate for pragmatic reasons. Cooperation is a realist necessity, not some kind of liberal accessory in this interconnected world. And that was, I think, was the lesson of the wartime generation, which we've lost, unfortunately, today. So yes, I think the US should join the ICC, and there are enough protections that countries have that the US doesn't have to be concerned that itself or its allies are going to be vilified. There are enough checks and balances in the system, I think.
I have to ask you, you brought up Poland about how it was one of the first countries to want to indict during the war and to prosecute Nazis. But today, it's a different Poland. And there was actually a declaration recently by the new government that people who associate Poland with Nazi war crimes should be jailed. Mm-hmm. It feels like it's a step back, no?
Well, if I can put a very personal opinion here.
Please.
I personally think it doesn't help to make Holocaust denial a crime, because that then sets you on this road. I think it's unfortunate and wrong that the Polish government did this, but to some extent I can understand, because this phrase Polish camps is out there.
Polish death camps, right.
Polish death camps is out there, and it's deeply offensive to Poles, and rightly so. And while there's widespread anti-Semitism then and now in Poland, there wasn't the kind of systematic collaboration with the Nazis that you saw in Ukraine, for example. So I think one can understand where Polish opinion is coming from. I would much rather that they triumph and uphold their role in prosecuting the Nazis for Auschwitz during the war, which was led by, initially this whole commission is led by a Pole, General Sikorski, wartime leader who tragically died during the war. And Poland has a very honourable record, which I think it could do better to rediscover in pursuing these issues. But I understand where the Poles are coming from because of this unfortunate phraseology, but criminalization is not a good idea.
It's just, in this era also of social media and catchphrases, nobody really thinks of digging into really knowing its history. So it is unfortunate.
Well, so people learn it, and I have to say, you journalists have got to blame, because you could say the camps in Poland, not the Polish camps. Even on the Aston line on the screen, it doesn't take that much more space in a headline, and then perhaps you wouldn't be in this.
That's certainly a fair point. That's certainly a fair point. I want to ask you, on a personal note, you're the son of a refugee.
Yes.
And you say that you were raised to remember but move on.
Yes.
But after discovering this trove of information, Can you move on?
Well, I hope so. There are sunnier things to think about.
But these are important things to bring to the fore, to bring
yes,
to light.
I have to say, I think it was having understanding of the context of the Second World War made me realise how important this archive was when I discovered it. But really, these are the sewers of the human soul, and I personally don't want to have to spend the whole of my life down them. My father and grandfather were, in fact, my grandfather was Einstein's doctor. You know, deeply involved in internationalism. Einstein was a pacifist and internationalist, and hopeful for the future. And I think that's what we have to focus on. You know, and people said to my father, "Well, you know, you're a bit of a party chap, party man in England." And he said, "Well, you know, the least we can do is to live life to the full. That's the least we can do for the people who died." And I think, you know, live life to the full. But on this, I think actually we need to remember the lessons of the people who did seek justice, and remember the lessons. It was the pragmatists who suppressed this information, the pragmatists who didn't even want Nuremberg, and the pragmatists today who say we shouldn't be bothered about human rights, whether it's in our own neighborhoods or internationally. And I think this story shows how costly that is and how heroic those people we should honor were.
So this year we celebrate the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is celebrating a significant anniversary. Human rights is not just this Western elite idea, right? Was that your discovery as well?
Well, I think anyone, even you just think about the golden rule in philosophy, do unto others as you would like to be done to, which is in all world religions and philosophies, that simple phrase shows this idea that human rights is just a Western elite intellectual invention to be nonsense, to be polite. But what you see from the pages of this archive are that Indians, Chinese, resistance fighters in Poland, in France, in Yugoslavia, are all pursuing a common agenda of holding the Nazis to account for these crimes which go beyond normal warfare, barbarism. And there is this meeting in a palace in London during the Blitz where they come together, and the Anglo-Americans don't want to come, but the occupied countries and the Chinese and are there, and they say, we need to restore civilization after we win. We can't just rely upon mob rule, and we need international support to install human rights standards. Now, the tragic irony is that those opposed to war crimes had this commission shut down when it's going full tilt, getting Nazis tried in court in 1948 on the grounds of rebuilding Germany. And the same year, many of the same officials are involved in then negotiating the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And the contrast, and to people who perhaps are thinking about this year, is that the Commission is an effective executive function of of states working internationally to indict, try, convict war criminals. The Universal Declaration is an aspirational, non-binding agreement that anybody can sign.
Of course.
And of course, 70 years later, it's treasured, it's become customary law. But in remembering the Universal Declaration, remember what we lost. How stronger things would have been if the Commission hadn't been crushed in the interests of domestic suppression of the African Americans and anti-communism. And I think that's important to elevate the Commission. It had its own pillar in the pantheon of human rights treaties and legislation. It's been missing too long. And I think we, in an exercise of restorative archaeology, we need to put the Commission back. These 17 countries, these heroes like Herbert Pell and Ben Ferencz, who did this work, up there alongside the Universal Declaration on Human Rights.
You know, speaking of Ben Ferencz, who wrote the foreword to your book, he's 98 years old. He was probably the youngest prosecutor at Nuremberg, and he's made it his lifelong mission to prosecute and to stop war, and he's a huge human rights advocate. I know that it saddens him greatly that these atrocities are still taking place in other parts of the world. But even for him, when you uncovered this archive, this was news. He didn't know.
Well, he said in my forward that this was an eye-opener, and I have to say that was deeply heartening, because I was worried that I was, going over old ground, or there was some fundamentally thing I got wrong. But he said, no, I had no idea that all of this work was going on. We were operating in our US military prosecutions unit and weren't aware of what had been going on. And in that time in the US government, there are these different agencies. So one of the benefits of the US government, you don't have this total centralization, but
still one isn't talking to the other.
The military prosecutors are going flat out to prosecute Nazis in Germany, whereas the State Department and the White House under Truman are doing their best to stop the whole thing. And they're writing memos saying, well, we can't stop it quite yet because it's got too much momentum and it'll upset too many people. Give it another year and we can shut it all down. Are the memos that are going back and forth in the State Department.
And why do you think that they couldn't come to an agreement on this? Why?
Well, you look at US politics, international politics today, there are similar dynamics. And that those people who favoured a kind of old-style realist approach, who thought it was important to bolster Germany against communism, those people who wanted to suppress African American rights, that you couldn't go around doing that at the same time as pursuing Nazis for comparable crimes. If the Nazis are hanging people from lampposts, what are you going to say when they're hanging people from lampposts in the South, to be blunt?
Correct.
One's a crime, the other's a crime, and I think that is at the root of it. My hero, Congressman Ambassador Pell, the hero in this story for America, he wrote to Congress and he said, he didn't mention the African American issue, but he said, well, they're very conservative in the State Department and they're anti-Semitic, and the Secretary of State owns most of a large part of the German car industry.
So that was enough.
That wasn't
right
me
there.
that wasn't me writing that. That was a former member of Congress saying that was what the motivation was.
Dr. Dan Plesch, thank you very much.
Thank you, Magdalene.